Thank you very much for inviting me and the warm welcome. It's around 35 years, I think, since I last sat in this room discussing politics. So some things don't change. I thought it'd be useful today to outline really where we are, essentially, in terms of Russia and Ukraine and its sort of bigger effect on international affairs. I would say that in my 35-year career, some of it in government, some of it semi-out of government, some of it fully out of government, there have probably been three inflection points. One, pretty much around 1989-90, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet bloc basically collapsed. And during that period, I was actually posted in Moscow from 90 to 93, so saw it firsthand. The second inflection point, of course, was 9/11, which everyone thought at the time would really define the way world politics and international affairs developed probably for a generation thereafter, which was, in hindsight, probably an exaggeration. And the inflection point that we're currently living through, which is in some ways almost a reversal of the first one, in that at the present time authoritarian states are challenging democratic norms and values and international law, and so I think that's where we are. So we've almost, in some senses, come full circle since 1989. And you might ask, how did we get here? And if you look at Russian history in particular, there have been periods of Russian history which, interestingly, usually follow defeat in war, when you have a sort of reform period. And whether it was in the period after 1905 or in the 1860s or in the 1990s, people in the West have tended to see that very optimistically, over-optimistically, as a sort of linear change, with Russia becoming more like a society like our own. And of course, sadly, what's happened in each case is that for one reason or another, history has proved to be more cyclical in Russia's case. And it's reverted to what autarky, I would say, is the system. It's not dictatorship as such, but it's certainly autarky. So where did we go wrong in the 1990s? And I think that where Russia went wrong in the 1990s was that whilst we had political reform and we had a far greater freer media and this kind of thing, the rule of law was never really properly established in Russia. And Russia traditionally had very weak, what you call civil society and political science, non-state institutions, organisations and structures. And although those developed to some extent, basic property rights, basic legal rights and so on were never instituted, which made it very vulnerable to a reversal, which is of course what we've seen, although that reversal has taken place over a much swifter period than the initial change in the 1990s. And if you look at the origin of the Putin regime, because I think whilst the 1990s in Russia was a difficult time, the leadership of Russia was still trying to push the country, the region, its neighbours, broadly in the right direction, towards a market economy, towards a constructive engagement with the West, and towards a sort of more responsible view of international affairs. That was in itself difficult and clearly not properly embedded. But the origins of the Putin regime are very telling, and something we talk about a lot in my sort of world is the apartment bombings at the end of the 1990s, which you probably know about, which certainly looked pretty soon afterwards, even at the time, but certainly now in hindsight, as the sort of leitmotif of Putinism, if you like. Essentially, these were bombs that went off in apartment blocks in Moscow and other cities in Russia, killing hundreds of Russians, and appear to have been a false flag operation by the FSB and by Putin to solidify their position in power, to justify the Second Chechen War, which in some ways is the founding myth, if you like, of the Putin regime. And yet we didn't really learn from that, we didn't really take note of that, and it's extraordinary to look back on some of the things that people like George W. Bush and Tony Blair and others were saying about Putin at the time, which I'm sure make them cringe these days when they hear them played back on podcasts and the like, that the Putin regime would return stability to Russia after the 1990s, that they would be partners and so on, which brings us on to the second inflection point, which I mentioned, which was 9/11. And in a sense, you can understand why people like Blair and Bush and the others tried to cultivate Putin and the regime in Russia at that point, because on the face of it, we had clear shared interests with Russia in opposing Islamism and international terrorism. But the trouble is that was oversimplistic, and what it failed to realise and what it failed to register was that, in a sense, for Putin, that was a means to an end, and the end of course, really rebuilding Russia's great power status and dominance over its neighbours and its parts of its constituent polity, notably the North Caucasus, of course, and Chechnya, and indeed other things which came to pass later, including what we would call a zero-sum view of the world. And this is why, of course, this approach failed, because essentially deeply ingrained in Putin is the view that whatever benefits Russia is to the detriment of the West and vice versa. So that's a fundamental problem that we didn't understand soon enough and didn't grapple with early enough. So what happened after that was you had this attempt to draw together after 9/11. You had some pretty significant foreign investments in Russia, BP's being the largest at the time. I think it was the biggest ever foreign investment in Russian history. It was clearly designed to increase the flow of hydrocarbons into Europe and to cheapen hydrocarbons, and if you cheapen hydrocarbons, you cheapen food production. A lot of the things that we've associated with globalization were linked in with this process. And so those business interests, you had the development, if you like, of a business elite which became its own interest group, its own lobby group in government, and was opposed to any kind of questioning, really, of the value of Putin and the regime he was bringing in, the stability that he claimed. So that developed to some extent differently in different countries. So one of the leitmotifs of Putinism has been divide and rule. So you work out, how to make a country or a political leadership dependent on you. You play that leadership off against another democratic leadership. You only need to look at the classic case of Turkey. I mean, if you look at the way Turkey has changed its sort of geopolitical trajectory in the last 20 years, it's massively been away from the West and towards Putin, but also towards general authoritarianism and that kind of system of government for which you could argue Putinism gave it top cover, Erdogan and so on. Germany, of course, became ever dependent on Russian gas in particular, and that led on to, if you like, an intellectualization of this attempt to justify it, if you like, in a sort of ethical and political sense. And we saw that with all the so-called resets that were talked about. There was one in America, there was talk of one here, there was the whole philosophy of Angela Merkel, which was relationships through trade, improving interdependency would lead to a wealthier Russia, a more stable Russia, a more reliable Russia. And this was, again, a big subject that we had discussed all the way through. Was it in our interest that Russia would become a rich country, a middle-income country, or remain a poor country? And very sadly, we're finding out at the moment the philosophy that it was better the richer Russia was, the more likely it was to be a reliable partner in a civilized country, sadly has failed, and this is one of the big challenges we've got now. I think also the West, this is difficult to quantify, of course, but I think the West lost its nerve in two ways. One was the real failure of the Iran War, the failure of neocon politics and economics, and the sort of discrediting, if you like, of the idea that the Western system of government was implantable in other societies, other cultures, in a relatively easy way, and that in fact, given a choice of an even playing field, people in every culture, in every country around the world would choose democracy and choose a liberal economy and choose anti-corruption and all the rest of it. Sadly, that didn't really work because of Iraq. And also, I think, because of the financial crisis in sort of 2008-9, where this system of democracy, which had been underpinned by liberal capitalism and large sort of privatisation, if you like, and globalisation, really was shown to be paper thin and not really to, I think, sort of support and enrich the vast number of people, both, well, particularly in the West, actually. I mean, come back to that. But globalisation was failing to deliver, I think, living standards and wealth to large parts of our populations in the UK, anything much outside the M25, to be honest, from my perspective. So we had those two kind of shocks to our confidence and our appeal and our strength. And that led on in a way to, as I've said, these resets, this constructive engagement, this kind of reluctance really. I would call it almost an ostrich type policy. I mean, I remember when the Litvinenko murder happened and the aftermath of that, when Theresa May was Home Secretary and tried to block there being a public inquiry into the murder because she was afraid of, you know, the consequences of Moscow and the economy being damaged, and it was all very unpleasant and too difficult. And that's again an example, I think, of where we really had lost our nerve and sent out all the wrong signals to people like Putin. Putin's kind of the vanguard of this, but, you know, take it as read that following up behind Putin are Xi Jinping and Erdogan and MBS and a whole host of others who are bad actors and a real problem in the world today for us to deal with. So constructive engagement effectively fails. Hillary Clinton, of course, who started it in America, ends up becoming public enemy number one for Putin. And so we go into the period after that and the first Ukraine war, which probably should have been an inflection point, in that it was the first time, certainly in Europe, when one country had literally grabbed the territory of another sovereign state and thereby committed one of the most flagrant transgressions of international law that exists. And yet our response to that was lukewarm, it was weak, it was divided, it sent the wrong signals. That should have been the inflection point where we drew a line in the sand and said, enough is enough, this is not acceptable. We now impose massive sanctions on you and we supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry and everything else that it needed to deter a Russian attack, a more full-scale Russian attack, of the likes we've seen more recently. So we went through a period where we were sort of in denial, where we were sort of bumbling along. We had our own problems to deal with, things like Brexit, obviously, which came a little bit later, in which the Russians were cock-a-hoop about, obviously. And then we have what can only be described as a certain anomaly in Western democratic history, which was the Trump administration. And I remember seeing Trump at the Helsinki summit, as some of you will have done in 2018 with Putin, standing on the platform with Putin saying, yeah, of course I supported Donald Trump for the presidency. An approach which is verboten, of course you're not supposed to say something like that as a statesman. You're supposed to say, we work with whoever is elected, and that is the choice of their own people. But that's also more fundamentally, I think, taking Putin's word seemingly over interference in the 2016 election, over his own intelligence services. And it still goes down that as one of the most extraordinary moments of modern American history. And one can only think of the damage that did to the American intelligence agencies, to their popularity and appeal in other countries, particularly non-aligned countries, the spectacle of that, the US president effectively cowering in front of Putin, in front of the world. And it really was an extraordinary time in which Trump certainly would have done, if he could have done, gutted and neutered the American intelligence agencies, both CIA and FBI. And if he comes back to power, no doubt would try to do so. And that kind of lives on in a sense. I mean, it's slightly in abeyance at the moment, but if you look at just the last 24 hours, the vote on the Ukrainian aid package and Rand Paul's position on that, if you look at tweets by people like Paul Gosar, who's a right-wing representative from Arizona, I think, you see that this kind of, under the surface, in Western societies, and in some of the most important Western societies, and certainly in America, under the surface and not that far under it, is a right-wing sort of discourse along the lines of, you know, Ukraine is not our ally, Putin is not our enemy, Putin represents a traditional, dare I say, white Christian civilization, although we all know that he doesn't. And that this still has a certain appeal amongst the sort of right in America, Fox News, people like that. And even now, in the midst of this blatant invasion of a sovereign country and a blatant sort of set of war crimes being committed in front of our eyes every day, these elected right-wing politicians in America seem to be regaining their confidence in talking about Russia and its system as something that is positive. Brexit, I mentioned, of course. We'll talk a bit more about that. Clearly doesn't look great, does it, in the present crisis, that we are squabbling with the French and the EU about, you know, customs lines in the Irish Sea and all the rest of it. And it certainly doesn't help in combating the likes of Putin and, of course, Xi and others. And then we had our pandemic, which, in a sense, the jury might still be out on. My feeling is that the early period of the pandemic was not handled well in the West, and particularly in America. And certainly the beginning of it, the way China handled it, and the way Russia covered it up and appeared to have handled it, were quite impressive, and certainly they were to other countries in the world and key swing countries in places like, you know, Indonesia and India and Brazil and all these other places that do matter, even though they're not quite in the Western camp. And that isolation, if you like, of the pandemic, I think also played into Putin. I mean, to put it bluntly, Putin was isolated, he was physically separate, he was not meeting people and talking to people, particularly other world leaders. And it seems that he became very much sort of obsessed and possessed with his own legacy and Russia's nationalism and Russia's entitlement to all these foreign lands that it used to rule. And they don't stop, of course, at Ukraine. You're talking about half of Kazakhstan, talking about Georgia and other places, which presumably fueled his determination to do something as he came out of the pandemic. And then finally, I guess, we have our debacle in Kabul last summer. It seems a lot longer ago than that, doesn't it? It was less than a year ago that there was a shambolic and divided and ineffectual withdrawal of, shameful in some ways, of Western forces from Afghanistan. A treaty, of course, negotiated by Donald Trump, even though Biden was, in my view, foolish enough to carry it through in the way it had been negotiated, which was to basically exclude the Afghan regime and government and do a deal with the Taliban, who then went back and said to the Afghan government, your game's up, guys, you know, the Americans aren't even including you in this, time to do a deal with us and let us take back in our power, otherwise you'll end up hanging from a lamppost, which is what obviously happened. So I think that shook Western unity. You then had this AUKUS, whatever it's called, submarine deal, that was a huge spat about that, and it just looked really divided and weak and sending out the wrong signals. And I guess in the immediate run-up to where we are now, several points worth making. One is that sanctions were not brought in quickly enough. There should have been sanctions brought in before the Russian invasion to make there being a stick for them not to invade would have been to have lifted them. That didn't really happen. Certainly the sanctions post 2014 were not sufficiently well targeted or effective or well implemented to deal with it. There was all sorts of other mistakes being made here in assessment. A misplaced lack of confidence and trust in the Ukrainian leadership. I mean, even I have been astonished about how brave and how effective both Israeli Ukrainian politicians have been, particularly Zelensky, but also unfortunately on the battlefield. No one expected this. Really didn't. It's a huge surprise. It's a very positive thing for the West, but we got this wrong basically in terms of governance, and fundamentally wrong at a sort of strategic level, which is probably one of the reasons we didn't commit all our weapons to them earlier. And of course, it emerges that Britain only started supplying lethal weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces and training them, which is obviously another really important part of that scenario from about the middle of 21 onwards. And that's something that not a lot of people know. I certainly wasn't aware of it. America started slightly early, but can you imagine the difference that would have been made if for the last 7 or 8 years we've been supplying weapons to the Ukrainians and training them to defend themselves? And so we made a lot of mistakes. We're making up for them now. I think we can talk about the stance we've got now, but I think what I wanted to do today was bring into perspective the reason we've got such a crisis now and how we reached this point, and what lessons we must learn in order to emerge from this with credit and with a positive outcome, and also in terms of how we handle other such crises in the future, because Russia's a tea party compared with China. If we ever get into this situation with China, with an economy 10 times the size of Russia's, we're going to really struggle. And so that's really what I wanted to lay out, as it were. Very happy to open those up to questions and to debate as we go through this.
Right, so I'll open up to the floor. So first question, go ahead.
Hi, good to see you again. I saw you at the Cambridge just a few weeks ago, I suspect. Interesting at this perspective. So I just wondered, you said that Britain could have done more in terms of supplying arms and training the Ukrainians earlier. Do you think that we ought to have considered and accelerated the potential for NATO membership earlier? Do you think if that would have happened, it would have avoided this catastrophe event?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think to be fair, to be honest, I mean, one of the incredible things that's happened in the last 10 years, is that 10 years ago, with some exceptions, you would have said that Ukraine was much more similar as a society and as a political system to Russia than it was to Britain, for example. And I think what's happened is that the last sort of couple of years, and particularly in the last few months, the sort of crossroads that Russia and Ukraine reached, and obviously they were historically and politically very intertwined and ethnically very intertwined over decades, centuries, has been very stark. So that, you look at Ukraine now and you think, when you hear a Ukrainian president talking or Ukrainian forces talking about the war, it's palpably like our leaders would talk or our military would talk. And Russia is just a complete sort of parallel universe, fantasy land. And I think there were real problems of compatibility of Ukraine with the West, both in terms of the EU and the NATO. I think it was going to be a process of evolution always, and I think the EU and the economics were going to go first, and the military would have come second. So I think that a rushed Ukrainian accession to NATO in the last couple of years would not really have worked. But I certainly think that, like with other allies around the world that we work closely with, and of course everyone's talking about Finland and Sweden now, we should have done more in terms of being allies and being engaged with them than we were, both militarily and otherwise.
Go ahead.
So obviously there's a lot of Russian disinformation leading up to the Brexit campaign, but also the United Kingdom has sort of taken a strong stance against Russia in the recent couple of months. Do you think Putin still has a vested interest in Boris Johnson as a leader of this country, or do you think that the actions taken by the United Kingdom have changed his views there?
It depends what you mean by vested interest, and I have to be careful what I say here, I suspect. But I think that there are two ways in which this, well, there are three ways in which this works. First of all, there is, whether Boris Johnson's and the government's policies happen to be things that Putin wants and thinks are in Russia's interests, and that could be a coincidence. I mean, no one's saying that people didn't have the right to vote with Brexit, they did. It just happens that Brexit is what the Russians were trying to promote. And what I always say to people who voted for Brexit, supported Brexit in Parliament and everything, is that you can't pick and choose. You turn a blind eye to Russian support for Brexit because it's what you believe, and then you find they're supporting Scottish independence in a couple of years, and you don't like that. So you can't have it both ways. You've got to say any interference is unacceptable. So Brexit, clearly, yes. And Boris Johnson carried out Brexit. It was a chaotic process. It was an ugly spectacle in Parliament, as we all know, for a couple of years. It paralysed British politics, really. In retrospect, it looks as though it was seen as a bigger deal than it actually is, but we could debate that separately. So in that sense, yes. In the sense of, I like to think of Britain as having a front door and a back door to Russia. And the front door has clearly been well and truly slammed now, but I'm not sure the back door has, and that's something we should debate. We lack a proper Foreign Agent Registration Act, we lack a proper Espionage Act, we lack the institutions to clamp down on dirty money and money laundering and everything else coming into Britain and through Britain, and the interest group it creates around it in that process. So I don't believe that, I believe the government's inaction, if you like, since at least 2020 on the Russia report, which I contributed to, it's been strange, to say the least. The way in which the Russia report was suppressed. I mean, what's that about? And you can't help but notice, I mean, there's a story in the media today about it, that there are some very shady, strange, questionable things going on in the party political funding area, which have clearly not been properly addressed, in my view.
Let's go here.
Thank you for your remarks, Mr. Steele. I have an international law question.
That'll stop me.
Sorry, I'm an Australian lawyer.
No,
so
go
I
on,
couldn't
fire
resist.
away.
Look, it seems to me that the UN Security Council is completely paralysed by, particularly by the permanent member veto. I guess you could argue that's been the case since 1950 in the Korean War, since Russia stopped abstaining from the Security Council. But I guess my question is, do you think, it seems like some other aspects of the UN are functioning, for example, the court's declaration to stop the war, but perhaps not particularly effectively. Do you think we're at a point like the 1917 dissolution of the League of Nations where we need a serious rethink of the legal international structure?
I'm afraid I do, yes. I mean, I think, you said that Russia was always difficult, truculent in the Security Council. I'm not sure that's true of the 1990s. And even actually, to be fair, one or two things under President Medvedev when he was in from 8 to 12, like Libya, and I think there were several, there was a Zimbabwe motion. So I think that we're in, we've gone through this inflection point, and the inflection point is that Russia has no pretense anymore of, being sort of a good, responsible member of the Security Council. The utter nonsense about biological sites and nuclear weapons in Ukraine is like something out of a kid's storybook. So I think we've got a real problem, and I think with the Security Council in particular, there's a certain amount of there's a newfound confidence amongst Russia and China to lie as long as the day is long in those places and to block everything. So I think we have to really seriously consider some kind of big change there, which might involve us withdrawing and trying to set up an alternative structure. The trouble is that at the moment, some of the big non-aligned players like India and Brazil and others are not really incentivized to come in and on board with us on that. And that's a big challenge. It's a whole different area. There are potential ways we could do that by giving them, I mean, permanent membership isn't actually the problem, it's the veto is the problem. So you could consider a structure where you offered Brazil and India a permanent seat but no veto. And it would just be majority voting, and that would be much more effective. But I'm not an expert in this, but I think we have gone through a point now with the way Russia and Nebenzia, in particular their ambassador at UN, it's become farcical. It's become a joke now, and it has no deterrence. And others will take note, you know, the MBSs and the Erdogans and all the others, because frankly, you know, just for the sake of it, the zero-sum thinking. The Russians and Chinese are not going to vote with us even on a third country that is misbehaving, because they'll see it as blocking our interests.
Sylvia?
You said that Russian history seems to have repeated itself. Do you think that Russia is fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy?
I don't think it's fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy. I think that at the moment the indications are that it is not it's not fertile ground for liberal democracy. I mean, one of the problems with Russia has always been, and you can see it now, because I can tell you some of the people in Russia are the bravest, most decent people that you'll ever meet, who are the Navalny's and the Karamazars and all the others going back to Sakharov and all these people. But it's a country where there's always been a very small elite and a very kind of small, it's a well-educated country compared with some countries in that sort of non-aligned, moderately wealthy sector, as it were. But it's not a place where civil society has ever been strong, and it's not a place where the rule of law has ever been particularly strong. And I've come to the conclusion after 35 years of this that actually more important than freedom of the press and the vote is the rule of law and to have a strong civil society. And if you look at those countries which have become true democracies from a pretty low point, South Korea, Chile or whatever, that's the pattern that was involved in those countries' development, and it's certainly very different from Russia.
Yeah, I would disagree that Russians have been educated like as a country ever after the 16th century. Maybe now also they're more or less educated. But I wanted to ask about why did the Tribal Republic, democracy in 1917 failed?
Sorry, the which republic?
Why did the Russian tribal democracy in 1917 fail? And are there any continuities that would have been tried to implement today?
You mean the Mensheviks?
With after the Tsar was...
Yeah, I mean after the Tsar was toppled, I mean I would actually argue that Russia's move to democracy came after 1905, when the Duma was first set up and when autocracy was in retreat. Interestingly, after defeating war. And of course, the same happened in 1917, which was another attempt to do it after the defeat in a war, and it was a defeat for Russia in 1917. And you had these two groups, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and one lot, the Mensheviks, led by Kerensky, were basically social democrats as opposed to Marxist communists. And they lost out, so they lost out because the other side was more brutal and more ruthless and more cunning, really, in many ways. But it wasn't fertile ground for democracy. The Russia collapsed basically in 1917, and it went from one extreme to the other. There was food, and there was a civil war raging. If the First World War had not broken out, and that's not even that big an if, actually, if you look at the history of the time, it is possible that Russia would have become more of a liberal democracy at that point. In the 1990s, sadly, what happened was that organised crime and oligarchy took over. The economy wasn't sturdy, wasn't solid, and without a solid, sturdy economy, which is what I was hinting at in terms of places like South Korea, Chile and others, you don't really get democracy being firmly implanted, in my view.
Please can you tell us some of your views on the Steele report, the Steele Dossier?
My views on my own work, that's not very honest, is it? Not self-aware.
And the aftermath of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's still quite a delicate subject in some ways, and elements of it are still sub judice, particularly in America. But I think what it did, it was a wake-up call. It postulated four things, basically. One was that there was a whole-scale interference campaign coming out of Moscow to try and interfere in the US election. Second point was the purpose of that was primarily to aid Trump and to damage Hillary Clinton. The third was that that was basically ordered. It wasn't some kind of rogue operation or some kind of low-level operation. It was very much driven from the top, from Putin himself. He had a particular loathing of Hillary Clinton. And fourthly, that there were parts of the Trump campaign and elements around Trump who were reaching out and cooperating with Russians and Russian agents as the campaign unfolded. And I would strongly argue that all those four things have been pretty well proven without doubt. I mean, we can go into specifics of different people and different scenarios. And obviously I know a lot more than is either in the dossier or I can talk about in this room. But intelligence work is not science, it's intelligence work is subject to a lot of the foibles of human existence. People misunderstanding what's said to them, misreporting sometimes what's said to them, misremembering sometimes what's been said, exaggerating things for certain purposes. It's all about context. The specifics are about context. The main message is not, and the main message was right in my view, or the four main messages. And I think we saw that in things like the Helsinki press conference that I discussed, where Putin actually admitted, basically, that he wanted Donald Trump to win and had been active in trying to achieve that.
Next question.
Thanks for the talk. I just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned about hydrocarbons and kind of Russia's prominence as like a net exporter of energy. How important do you think the sort of energy security angle is going to be? Because I'm reading, some people are saying we should invest more into non-Russian oil and gas assets. I think just this morning, like Blackstone and BlackRock was saying we should increase investment, and on the other side, there's a view that we should reduce our reliance on hydrocarbons so that kind of Russia and the Middle East and other players like that can't leverage that. What's your view on that? Like how significant that's going to be going forward?
I think this war has kind of accelerated some of the pressures and some of the debates and made some of these decisions more urgent than they were before. I mean, gas was seen essentially as a sort of intermediate step away from hydrocarbons. Obviously, coal was the worst, and then oil, and then gas. And what we're seeing now, obviously, is gas is a political weapon. Surprise, surprise. We were shouting from the rooftops about this 15 years ago after the first gas cut-off from Ukraine. So I think it's accelerated those processes. I think realistically there are some major economies of our allies, including like Germany, who, for their own mistakes they've made in many ways in the past, are hugely vulnerable to this and are not going to be able to just cut off Russian gas or whatever, Russian oil overnight. But certainly from both a climate perspective and a geopolitical perspective, we have to move quickly and as a priority away from dependent on these regimes and their hydrocarbons. And I welcome the government's commitment now to building 8 nuclear power stations in this country. And I just think we don't have any choice. Of course we should develop, solar and tidal and wind and all the rest of it, but ultimately battery technology, which is vital, because certainly those three aren't uniform throughout the year or even throughout the day. We are going to need nuclear as part of that mix going forward. but we are going to have to really try and get ourselves weaned off hydrocarbons quite quickly. I'm not ruling out new investment in North Sea or whatever temporarily for 5 years or whatever it's going to be, but we definitely need to have this as one of our top priorities now, because it's preventing us achieving our foreign policy objectives. It's that simple. You know, Putin got, what was the figure? 35 billion euros since the beginning of the war from hydrocarbon sales, and we'd get the EU given $1 billion in aid to Ukraine. I mean, that shows you how serious a problem this is. This war is being financed by Western purchases of Russian hydrocarbon. Simple as that.
Is there a hand back there? Yeah.
Yeah. Given Russia's apparent intention of supporting Ukraine for the long term and thus increasing material and financial support to Ukraine, when do you think, at any point, the Chinese will change their position? So far, it seems like they've been unwilling to provide any support to Russia, but do you think there's any point at which they may change that stance, or any factors which may drive them to reconsider?
No, I don't. I mean, I actually think that the Chinese are doing less to support Russia than they're pretending to do in public. I mean, I think they'll give them lip service. They'll, where interests coincide in the UN Security Council, the places they will, ostensibly support. But I think this is one of these unrealities that, on planet Putin, he's an equal of Xi, and Xi respects him and will support him and do this, that, and the other. Not true. It just isn't true. Russia and China are not natural allies. They're not natural bedfellows. China is is a rising power. It's a savvy power. It's an economic power. Fundamentally, China's power in the world today is economic. Russia's is not. And I just think it's foolhardy of Putin to kid himself that he's going to have some cosy equal relationship with China going forward. He's not. China will do what's in China's interests, and China's interests will often not coincide with Russia. And they drive a hard bargain. They'll get their hydrocarbons a lot cheaper than we were, and they'll make no bones about it. And of course, ultimately, when you look at Russia east of the Urals, they've got a big problem because no one lives there, and there are millions and millions of Chinese living in that region. And whether it's through economic, assimilation or anything else, parts of that territory are going to come under heavy Chinese influence quite quickly, in my view. And fresh water will be the next one. That's the one to watch. Lake Baikal. Do you know Lake Baikal contains 20% of the world's fresh water? Incredible. And that is a resource for the future that the Chinese will want.
Next question.
You spoke about Navalny and the sort of dissidents within Russia.
Yeah.
And while they've sort of been against the war in particular, they've been quite soft on Crimea and sort of Russia's imperial ambitions in Ukraine. And this is true throughout Russian history. So during the Soviet period, dissidents, whilst they sort of complained about lack of rights within the USSR, they never sort of extended that to rights for Ukraine. So I was wondering if you thought this antagonism between the two countries is more of a cultural issue with Russia rather than particular to the current regime.
It's more like England and Ireland. I mean, that's my analogy for you, or England and Scotland. And so there are historical tensions and issues going on there, but they are fundamentally cousins, essentially. And there are probably more people in Russia of Ukrainian descent than there are Ukrainians of Russian descent, or whatever. I mean, there's a whole sort of set of things there. Notoriously, of course, the Brezhnev Communist Party leadership was full of Ukrainians. Khrushchev was Ukrainian, Brezhnev was Ukrainian, Chernenko was Ukrainian. I mean, incredible. The Russian Empire was very odd. It was ruled by non-Russians, Stalin and Beria. You can go through them all. Gromyko was Belarus. So there's some very strange relationships going on there. And as we always used to joke when I lived in Moscow, what empire in history is the capital city poorer than the ones on the periphery? Anyway, that was the case. So I think there is an element of nationalism which is a worry among some of these oppositionists, but taking it as a whole, obviously, you know, if you were to look at Russia on its face, what it needs is massive foreign investment from the West, massive technological investment. It needs to retain its elites, it needs to retain its educated young people, and it's failing to do all of those things. And certainly people like Navalny and the others would be a massive change in that regard. They would abandon zero-sum thinking, which is the key to this.
Let's go here.
What sort of, amidst this whole confusion and mess of media narratives, what are the issues perhaps we should pay more attention to, more deserving of our attention? Because media is also different in, for instance, Eastern Europe and West Europe. I'm from East Europe, so.
I think one of the things is the point that was just made, and I don't accept, and it might sound rather mean in this, but I don't accept this is Putin's war. I think there is quite a lot of support for this war inside Russia amongst the general population, and it's not just determined by propaganda. And I think that's something that's very worrying and needs to be addressed. And I can see why Western leaders don't want to address it, certainly not in public. They need to understand it. And they also need to understand that there is no way forward. And I think they do understand this, although this is probably the opposite. They shouldn't be talking about it in public, but they should be planning for it in private. I can talk about it in public. There is no way that Putin, we can go forward and have any sort of normal business with Russia as a country if Putin stays in power. Can't trust a single thing he says. He's a megalomaniac. He's determined to breach every rule and every value that we believe in. And he's got to go, basically. And anything we can do to hasten that is a good thing. But we can't do it in broad daylight, unfortunately, because of all sorts of other reasons.
Even some pragmatic Russians say that it's, even though Putin is not ideal, it's better to have him because all the other alternatives are worse. And if he goes, then Kadyrov and Chechnya, they will be glad to continue their sort of war and infighting within Russia because they're only loyal to Putin, not loyal to Russia.
Yeah, I don't really buy that. I think that Putin has gone over a waterfall or over a cliff in the last 6 months, and I think we're in a completely different scenario now than we were. He's gone beyond the point of any return, and I think we need to recognise that, and governments need to deal with it, even if it's only sort of behind the scenes.
I think we have time for one more question. So.
Given what you just said about Putin, do you think the UK's defence policy is still appropriate? And if not, what would you do differently?
Is there something particularly you have in mind?
In terms of some reduction of traditional warfare that we're seeing in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think my friend Deborah Haynes of Sky did who's been in Kiev for about the last 6 months. She did a thread on Twitter on this the other day and said, if you don't have security, you don't have proper defence, everything else is, a waste of time really. You could be invaded and scragged like Ukraine has been. And I think that's very true. I think we've run down our armed forces disgracefully. The so-called peace dividend is, a myth really. And I think that, we've got an army of 70,000 and it should be at least twice that size, I think. Certainly our Navy. We've invested more in our Navy, to be fair. But I do wonder about some of our kind of technology now, these 2 big aircraft carriers, and you see what drones can do to tanks and ships and things like that. So I think there's a wake-up call here. Ironically, it shows you the degree to which you can't have proper security unless you've got strong conventional forces. And I think there's been an assumption that because you've got the ultimate nuclear and other forces sitting there, that you're okay at a sort of tactical level, and you're not. And that's what this is bringing home, I think.
I think that's all we've got time for today. Can we have a huge round of applause for Mr. Christopher Steele?